Hi guys, today I'm going to show you how you can master the camera raw filter in Photoshop. And I'm going to start right now. Hi guys, and welcome back to the channel. My name is James, and if it is the very first time to this channel and you want to learn all about Photoshop, Lightroom and everything photography related, start now by subscribing and hitting the bell so you don't miss anything. So in this video guys, we're going to be talking about the camera raw filter, and this is my masterclass tutorial all about how to understand and master the camera raw filter. So the camera raw filter is a sub-program built into Photoshop. Now the reason camera raw filter actually exists is because the Photoshop can't actually open raw files. So for instance, if you took a photo on a Canon, Nikon or Sigma or any kind of camera, it will have either a JPEG or a RAW file that you can photograph. Now if you shoot JPEG, it doesn't really matter what program you use, any program can open JPEG. But if you're shooting a RAW file, you'll be able to use the camera raw filter to open up in Photoshop. But what's special about the camera raw filter is you're allowed to utilize different sliders and tools before you open it up in Photoshop. And that's what we're going to be discussing today. So if you'd like to have a look at any of the pre-selected photos that I'm going to be using in this tutorial, then go ahead to the link in the description. But without further ado guys, let's get started. So the first thing I'm going to discuss is how you can actually access the camera raw filter. So there's actually two ways of accessing the camera raw filter. The first way is by shooting in RAW and using the camera raw filter when it opens up in Photoshop. Because again, like I was saying, that you actually need a sub-program in Photoshop to actually access the raw file information before you open it up in Photoshop. Because Photoshop can't actually open raw files. And the second way is actually using it as a filter effect in your settings in Photoshop. So today what I've done is, you can see on my desktop, I've got the one on the left hand side is a RAW file, and on the one on the right hand side is a JPEG file. Now because I shoot Canon, it's a CR2 file format. But for instance, if you shoot maybe Nikon, Sony or any other camera brand other than Canon, you're not going to be necessarily seeing the same file format. You might be something slightly different, but again, they're all RAW files. So as long as it's not JPEG or TIFF, it will be probably a RAW file on your computer. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to right click on the camera raw, and I'm going to go to open with, and as you can see, as set to my default is Photoshop 2020. So if I go ahead and just click open, as you can see, it's opened up in camera raw, and we can see that by the dialog box that's opened and the camera raw filter, and as you can see, I've got the 12.2 operating system. So it's the most up to date at the moment. So that is something to do bear in mind, is you do want to keep your camera raw up to date as well as Photoshop if possible. And then as you can see here, you can see the camera that I shot, which obviously I shoot a Canon 60 Mark II. Now once we're in it, as you can see, it's broken up into three different sections. So the ones at the top here, at the left, as you can see, are basically a bunch of different tools. On the right hand side here, you can see firstly at the top, you can see your histogram broken up obviously in highlights, exposure and shadows. And then obviously you've got all the sliders here, but as well as the sliders, you've also got these panels which allow you to change certain things, and that's what I'm going to be predominantly discussing today. And then as you can see at the bottom here, we've got a few extra buttons. These are predominantly preview buttons to allow you to change between before, after, or kind of changing a bunch of other ways of displaying the photo on using the camera raw filter. And then right at the bottom here, you have got your color settings. So if you go ahead and click, it will bring up with your workflow options, and it allows you to change your color space. So that is the RGB settings that you've chosen. So for instance, I shoot Adobe 1998, but for instance, if you wanted to change it for uploading to Instagram, you can always change it to sRGB or Pro Photo RGB. Again, that's something that you probably want to look into a little bit further. And then again, you've also got your bit depth. So for instance, you've got 8-bit and 16-bit. And today I'm just going to discuss a little bit about bit depth in this tutorial. But at the moment, I'm just going to keep it at 8-bit depth. And then obviously you've got resizing and everything like that, but we're going to leave it to Photoshop to deal with all that. What we're going to do today is I'm just going to color grade the photo and just add a few effects to show you what the camera raw filter can do. So I'm going to go ahead and click OK. So that is how you can use or open the camera raw filter shooting a raw file. But what happens if you shot a JPEG file? Well, what I'm going to do is I'm just going to press cancel. What I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and open the JPEG file now. So I'm going to right click on that, open with, and I'm going to open with Photoshop. Now, as you can see, because it's a JPEG file, it just automatically opens up in Photoshop. So how do you access the camera raw filter? Well, what I'm going to do first, I'm just going to press Command J on our keyboard. This will allow us to revert back to the original image, just in case you make a mistake in the camera raw filter. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to go up to Filter. And then as you can see, we've got the camera raw filter in our filter settings of Photoshop. So we'll go ahead and click Camera Raw Filter. And then again, the dialog box opens, but as you can see, a few bits of information are missing. So if we look at the top here, as you can see, it just says Camera Raw and then the file photo name, which we've got. But as you can see, all of that workflow information is missing. And that is what the benefit of shooting RAW is. You have a lot more information, and you can also change the bit depth and also the workflow and color space all within the camera raw filter before you open it up in Photoshop. Now, of course, you can change all that information in Photoshop. There's obviously there's no much of a difference, but what's great about the camera raw is you can change it before it opens in Photoshop. So any effect that you want to apply, you can always apply it before you open it, which is a great and really handy. And this is why I really like using the camera raw filter for this particular instance. So there we go. So there are the two ways of accessing the camera raw filter, either using a RAW file or a JPEG file. Now what I'm going to move on to is just a bunch of the kind of different techniques and filters that you can use in Photoshop. So obviously I like shooting in RAW, so I'm just going to use RAW as an example, but you can follow along with a JPEG file, as all of the stuff that I'm going to be doing from now on, you can either do using a RAW file or using a JPEG file. It makes absolute no difference. But today, because I like shooting in RAW, because you have more information in the highlights and shadows, you can kind of stretch the information a bit more in the photo. That's why I like shooting in RAW, so that's why I'm going to be using RAW in this particular tutorial. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to go right click on the RAW file, open with, and then I'm just going to open with Photoshop. So like I was saying previously, it is split into 3 separate sections. So at the top here, you've got a bunch of tools. On the right here, again, you've got predominantly sliders, and then you've got the information at the bottom. But the 2 areas that I'm going to be focusing on in this particular tutorial is at the top here, where you've got all of the tools, and then predominantly all of the information on the right-hand side, the sliders, is why you would use the camera raw filter. So firstly, let's talk a little bit about the sliders on the right. So as you can see, the main, or what you would call the basic panel, which is the main panel that you can see here, is broken up into 3 separate sections. So at the top here, you've got white balance. Now this changes the temperature of your photo, but also you can change the tint to get the white in your photo as perfect as you would like. Next, you've got exposure. Now again, you've got an auto button just above here that allows Photoshop, for instance the camera raw filter, to automatically change it for you. But if you want to change it manually, you don't just have to change the exposure, but you've also got contrast, highlights, shadows, whites and blacks. And instead of, for instance, Photoshop, which you only have usually an exposure and contrast slider, for instance, if you use the exposure and contrast adjustment layer, this allows you to change a lot more information. And again, because we shot in RAW, there will be more information in the shadows, so you could really bring up the shadows. And then lastly, we've got the last section here, and this is predominantly sliders for effects. So for instance, you've got texture, clarity, dehaze, but you've also got 2 color sliders. So for instance, you've got vibrance, which is how kind of vibrant or pure the color is. And then you've got saturation, which is all to do with the intensity of the color. So again, you've got those sliders there as well. So if we go ahead and we just want to increase the brightness of this photo, we can do so just a little bit. So as you can see, it works in points. So we've got a 0.5 of a stop brighter. So for instance, if I shot at 100th ISO, but I wanted to brighten it up by 0.5, it'll be 150. Next, what we do is we're going to just increase the contrast ever so slightly. like so. But as you can see, the highlights are quite bright. So all we need to do is we've got the highlights section here. We can just lower the amount of brightness in the highlights, and that is without affecting the rest of the photo. And again, with the shadows, what we can do is actually raise the information in the shadows. Lovely, look at that. Now, obviously we've got whites and blacks. This is to do with the point of where the exposure of the white, or how much of the white is in the photo. So for instance, if we raise that up, as you can see, it increases the amount of white in the photo, and it's very similar to blacks. So that's the main difference between highlights and shadows, is highlights and shadows affect a large band of the highlights and a large band of the shadows, where blacks and whites affect the tip of the very end of the exposure. So if we look at our histogram and we move the whites, as you can see, it's predominantly affecting the very, very right hand side of the histogram. So you want to kind of treat the whites and blacks as a very last resort of bringing back the information from the very either highlights or the shadow. Now I often try and take the photo or the exposure correct at the point of shot, so obviously when I took the photo, so I don't often change the white or black points. But again, if you either undershot or overexposed your photo, that is possible to change. And then again, obviously we've got our texture and clarity. Now texture is the amount of texture in the photo, and what it does, it just enhances it. So what we can do is we can just simply increase the texture a little bit, and as you can see, it's brought a little bit more of the pores of the information. But what it does is it leaves all the blurry or out of focus areas alone. Clarity is very similar to contrast, but what it does is it increases the difference between it close to the edges of where that contrast lies. So for instance, if we whack it up all the way, as you can see, the difference between the highlights and the shadows within the eyes, especially, as you can see, has been increased. So I often try and just very carefully increase this slider, but not too much, because it can be a detriment to the photo. And dehaze, that kind of says it what it is on the tin. It just removes any of haze or fogginess from the photo. And in this particular photo, as you can see, there isn't much of haze in it, so I often leave that slider alone. And then again, you've got vibrance and saturation. Now this is something, again, I often change in Photoshop, but you do have the ability of changing it in Camera Raw. So what we can do is go to our next section, and this is tone curve, and you've got two. So you've got point curve, but you've also got parametric. And it is again very similar to the basic sliders that you can see on our exposure, but this allows you to change it using the histogram overlay if you've ever used the curves adjustment layer. Now again, I often leave this alone and just focus it working on the basic panel, but again, you have got that opportunity if you are that type of photographer. Again, this is all about your workflow. This is my particular workflow and how I like using the Camera Raw, but once you start using the Camera Raw a little bit more, you'll understand your own workflow and how you would like to work. So today I'm just going to try and show you absolutely everything, and then you can decide on what bits that you like the most, and you can utilize that in your own workflow. So after we've got tone curve, we've got detail. Now this is a great slider, and it's a lot better than the sharpening or any of the other effects that you can get within Photoshop. So what we can do is we will zoom in. So we've got sharpen, but instead of just sharpen, we've got amount, radius, detail, and we've also got masking. And then we've also got reduce noise as well. So you can sharpen it and reduce noise in the same effect. And again, you've got obviously the luminance, but you've also got color, color detail, and color smoothness. So for instance, if you shot at a high ISO, what it can do is it can remove all of those kind of red, green, and blue blotches that you might get either in the shadows or highlights if you either under or overexpose the photo. Now again, I like to erase it just ever so slightly in my presets, just to kind of sharpen up the areas that need it. But again, I always try and shoot as perfect as I can at point of shot, so a lot of these effects are just minor tweaks. So we can obviously increase the noise, and I like increasing the smoothness of it, just to remove, as you can see in the background, we've got this kind of RGB kind of effect going on, and that's again probably because I shot it at quite a high ISO, so that's something again you can affect with noise reduction. Next we've got is probably one of the most powerful sliders in Photoshop Camera Raw filter. This is what you would call the HSL adjustment. HSL stands for hue, saturation and luminance. So you've got 3 different panels here. So you've got hue, you've got saturation, and you've also got luminance. Now what's great about using the HSL slider, instead of for instance using the hue and saturation adjustment layer, is because you've got more colors to use. So for instance in the hue and saturation adjustment layer, you've got reds, yellows, greens, cyans, blues and magentas. But in this, you've got reds, orange, yellows, greens, aquas, blues, purples and magentas. So as you can see, you've got more colours to use and to slide around. So you have a more customisable way of changing the colours in the photo. So for instance, in this particular photo, I'm probably going to want to change the blues to more of a cyan to create a bit more of a split complementary colour theme. So all we can do is go into the blue section here and we can move it over to the left. And as you can see, that has changed the colours from blue into more of a cyan teal colour. And again, we can do the same with the aquas. So you see, we can move these sliders around. Now again, obviously you've got the skin tones, a problem you found in the reds and yellows, but obviously we've got the advantage of using orange as well. So we've got reds, yellows and oranges to change the skin tones. So as you can see, we move the reds. We can do that a little bit. We can also move the oranges. Now I'm guessing the oranges is predominantly where the skin tones are found. So we can do it like so, add a little bit more of a yellowy tinge to it. And then again, we've got the yellows as well. So we'll probably increase the yellow orange a little bit to bring out a bit more of a balanced skin tone effect. So we'll go for something, maybe we'll go for 10 for the oranges. Lovely. Now after you've changed the hue, you can obviously change the saturation. So for instance, if you wanted a particular colour gone or you want to increase the saturation of that colour, you can simply do that. But again, because you've got more customizable sliders, you have more opportunities of changing the colours in the end run. So again, this is the advantage of using the Camera Raw over using certain adjustment layers in Photoshop. And again, obviously you've also got luminance, which is the brightness of that photo. So for instance, in this particular effect, I would probably want to increase the, decrease the yellows, and then I'll probably increase the reds ever so slightly. Again, this is just skin toning effects. So I'll probably go for something like so. Lovely, I'm loving this photo so far. I'm really liking what we're doing. So what we're going to do now is I'm just going to move over to the next slider. Now this is a great slider, and I must say, I would say it's very underutilized, as I see most photographers don't use it, but I absolutely love split toning. Now split toning is a way of splitting the highlights and the shadows and adding a color or a hue to them independently from each other. And then you've obviously got the balance in between highlights and shadows. So this is a way very similar to, for instance, if you've ever color graded, you can add a certain hue to the shadows, and then you can add a different hue to the highlights. So if you've ever used a gradient map before, this is very, very similar. But what's great about this is, again, it's just built into Camera Raw filter. So you can change it or adapt it as much as you like. So what we're going to do is I'm just going to zoom out. As you can see, we've got a great selection. So we've got highlights in the main kind of portrait model here, but you've also got some shadows. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to add in a blue to the shadows, but add more of a warmth tone to the highlights. So as you can see, we've got the highlights here, we've got a hue and saturation slider. So what we're going to do is we're going to change the hue to, let's go for 45, which 45 is kind of like an orange colour. And then all you'll need to do to add that effect, just simply increase the saturation. And as you can see, it has added a nice orange tone to it. So I'm going to go for a saturation of 20. Now again, if you'd like to add more blues or any other colour, for instance, into the shadows, we can do the same using the hue slider. So you want to choose the colour. So we're going to choose a blue. And then to add the blue, increase the saturation. So we'll increase the saturation like so. Now as you can see, it's adding it to the whole photo, and it's not necessarily adding it just to the shadows. So what we can do is use our balance slider here and just simply move it over to the left. And as you can see, that will increase the blue or increase the orange. So you can move that slider around to get the right balance in your photo. Lovely. Now this is lens correction. Now in particular, you shooting camera raw, you have the lens information built into the photo. But if you have a JPEG file, you won't have that information built in. So again, this is using the difference between RAW and JPEG. There's loads of pros and cons, but the pro of shooting RAW is you have more information. Now with this, obviously you've got a profile, so you can set the profile to the camera and lens that you've used, and it will change or remove barrel distortion and chromatic aberration. And you can do this both by enabling profile correction, which is obviously shooting what camera you've used and what lens you've used. So as you can see, automatically it already knows I've shot Canon. My model was EF 50mm 1.4, which is the lens that I used. And obviously then it's got the profile, which is the lens again. And obviously you've got distortion and vignetting. And what this will do is it will actually remove it for you. But if you were using, for instance, the JPEG format and you don't have that information available, you can always use a manual setting. So again, you can change the distortion here, you can change the vignetting here, and then you can also change the amount of fringing, or for instance, another word for that is chromatic aberration, which is some blues or purples that appear on contrasting edges. You mostly notice it, for instance, if you took a photo of a windowsill, you might notice kind of like a purple haze. And this is just to do with light bouncing around in your lens, chromating these kind of fringing effects. And you can remove this using the lens correction feature in the camera raw filter, which is really handy, and it's probably the only way of actually changing this, as you'll find that this isn't actually possible using it in Photoshop. So this particular effect is really, really handy. So once you've changed all of that, and you've changed, for instance, the amount of distortion, we can move on to the next. Now this is effects. There are two effects in this particular tutorial. There's grain, and there's also post-cropping vignetting. Now for instance, grain is obviously kind of what it says on the tin. You can add grain. But obviously what's the difference between adding grain in Camera Raw versus Photoshop is you can change the size and roundness of the grain. So for instance, if I added in grain, let's add in, let's say 50. We'll zoom in, and as you can see, we've added in grain here. Now, Photoshop, that's all you can do. But what's great about this, you can change the size. So for instance, we'll make the grain quite large. So for instance, if you're after more of a vintage feel to your photo, you can make quite large grain. And you can also change the roundness of the grain, which obviously is how round the grain spots are on the photo. So for instance, you can make them nice and sharp, so reduce it down to 0. And you can add the size all the way up to 100. And it adds this kind of weird kind of effect. But again, depending on what photo you're chosen, or depending on what type of grain you're after. But I don't really like grain, so what I'm going to do, I'm just going to take it all the way to the left, and that'll just turn the grain feature off. And then you've also got post-crop vignetting, which again, obviously, vignetting is the edge of the photo, either it's white or black. And again, what we can do is if we slide it to the left, as you can see, it's adding in a dark vignette. But if we add it to the right, it'll add a white vignette. But again, what's special about the Camera Raw filter, again, you've got what's really kind of special about the Camera Raw is it's got all of these sliders. And I'm going to probably say this for every single feature that we're talking about. Every single effect has extra sliders to it. So you've got more customizability in Photoshop. So again, we're going to add a little bit of a post-cropping vignette. Again, we can change the midpoint, the roundness, the feather, and you can also even change the highlights. So this is what I love about the Camera Raw filter, is you've got so many different sliders to really tweak your photo to get the exact effect that you're after. And then what we've got is the very last kind of effect here, and this is calibration. And this is to do with, again, the white balance. You can change the white balance using the tints, hues, and then you've also got greens and blue primaries. And this again goes a lot more in depth to kind of changing the exact white balance. Now obviously you've got the traditional white balance, which is just simply temperature and tint, but this obviously breaks it down into a lot further options. So for instance, it's kind of like a little bit like the hue and saturation adjustment layer, where you're able to change the hues, but what we've got is the sliders don't obviously have such large of a range of colour, so it allows you to adapt each colour independently from each other. So for instance, obviously you've got the blues, greens, reds, and then obviously you've got the shadows with there. And obviously you can change the version, so obviously I've got the latest version, but obviously you can predate it if you, for instance, got an old photo. And then the very last one here are presets. So what you can do is, after you've changed all of this, what you can do is go down and click this little button here. And what this will do is it will save it as a preset. So if you've ever used a Photoshop action before, or if you've ever used a Lightroom preset, for instance, if you took lots of photos, like for instance you're a wedding, and you want a very similar style to it, but you don't want to go in and constantly keep changing all of the sliders like we've just talked about, what you can do is create a preset. So what we can do is click on that, and as you can see, we've got the name of the preset. Now again, you've got all of the profiles that we've changed. So for instance, this is everything that we've changed in the photo. So you've got texture, blacks, whites, shadows, highlights, all of this. Make sure is all of them that you've changed are ticked. Name it. So I'm just going to name this test 1.0. And then all you'll need to do is click OK. And as you can see in user preset, you've got test 1.0, and you can have as many as you want, and you can also favorite them as well. So if we click that, as you can see, it pops up in your favorites. So again, if you ever want to add this particular effect in the camera raw, again, you can always use the effects filter preset. And then the last one here is kind of just snapshots, and this basically has all of the photos that you're editing at the same time, that you can compare them using the kind of large thumbnail on the right hand side. So what we can do is, once we've done all of that, all you'll need to do is simply go ahead and just open image. And what that will do is that will open all of those effects, it will read the camera raw format, and it will open it up in Photoshop. And that is how you can use the camera raw filter to change a bunch of different effects, techniques, and even color grading in Photoshop using the camera raw filter. And again, all you'll need to do is, if you do shoot in JPEG, all you'll need to do is press Command J to duplicate that layer, and then go up to filter, and then you can access the camera raw filter using JPEG. And again, all of what we've just talked about is possible in JPEG format as well. Brilliant, and there we go guys. So that is how you can understand and master the camera raw filter. And I must say, it's one of my favourite ways of either colour grading or just changing the exposure of a photo. Again guys, if you want to like, comment and subscribe to my channel, it really does help my channel grow. Also, if you want to hit the bell notification so you don't miss any of my latest content. But until next time guys, keep creating.